Chapter 6: Explosions and Implosions. The flame shot upward, fueled by a break in a city gas line. The line had ruptured when a private contractor, clearing land, clipped a gas pipe. At first, just the pressurized gas poured out, hissing loudly. But within 30 minutes, a random spark had ignited the natural gas, which flamed skyward. Within minutes, the fiery plume was almost 5 stories high and only a few yards away from Chicago public housing that lodged senior citizens. Fortunately, police and others evacuated the residents from the building. But when the gas company finally stopped the fuel feeding the line, scores of people had been displaced, their housing gutted or scorched. 2 months later, another explosion would displace Chicago residents. This time, though, the explosion was planned. A series of dynamite charges rigged by a demolition company popped in succession, and one by one, for adjoining buildings at a different public housing project fell, crumbling to the ground and raising huge clouds of dust. But this explosion was actually an implosion, with building materials falling inward. The destruction had been planned for months, as part of an ongoing project to replace crime-infested, run-down housing with new, low-rise developments. In fact, former residents and other spectators watched a safe distance away, some applauding. Which do you think was the more destructive event? Was it the gas line explosion that charred the side of a building and left people without homes? Many would say yes. But in truth, both the gas explosion and the building implosion had equally destructive consequences. The imploding of the housing project destroyed more buildings and left many residents feeling a sense of loss for the home they had known for years. Likewise, implosive anger can be as damaging as explosive expressions of anger. We have looked at constructive ways of responding to anger in the last 3 chapters, but let's be honest, many of us have never learned to handle anger positively. We see that our responses to anger in the past have always made things worse. We find it hard even to believe that anger itself is not evil. We see the angry behavior of children, teenagers, and adults flashed before the world each day on the television screen, the crime and war and suffering that anger leaves in its path of destruction. How then can we recognize and control harmful expressions of anger? Explosive abuse. Margaret was a screamer. When someone stirred her anger, whether child, husband, or employer, the person heard about it. Margaret prided herself on speaking her mind. "At least people know where they stand with me," she often said. In truth, Margaret's anger was out of control. Beginning as a teenager, she had fallen into a pattern of verbally abusive behavior that had continued for 25 years. Margaret justified her tirades until the day her daughter left her the following note. "Dear Mom, I won't be home tonight. I can't take your screaming anymore. I don't know what will happen to me, but at least I won't have to hear all the nasty things you say to me when I don't do everything you want." She signed the note, Ginny. Margaret didn't scream when she read Ginny's note. She called her pastor in tears. First she said only, "Ginny has left. I don't know where she's gone. I'm so worried about her." Then she said the most hopeful thing she had said in years. "I drove her away. I know I drove her away. My screaming and yelling drove her away." Sobbing into the phone, she admitted for the first time that her angry tongue lashings toward Ginny were wrong. The pastor wisely guided Margaret to a Christian counselor, where she began the process of admitting, understanding, and changing her negative responses to anger. Ginny was located within 48 hours and later joined her mother in counseling. Today, Ginny, now a grown woman, has a good relationship with her mother. Margaret says that the day she got Ginny's note was the worst and best day of her life. On the other hand, Paul's abuse tended toward the nonverbal. Whenever he was angry with someone, he would throw things, break things, and make rude gestures in traffic. Paul had gone so far as to hurl soft drink bottles in family arguments. Liz had seen some of these characteristics in Paul before she married him, but he had never vented his anger toward her. But within 6 months after their wedding, he pushed her against the wall. She knew that his behavior was something she could not condone. She wrote him the following letter and mailed it to his office. "Dear Paul, last night you did something I never thought you would do. In anger, you pushed me against the wall. I had seen you express anger while we were dating, but I never thought you would express it toward me. Now I know that I was wrong. I love you very much, and I don't believe that you really want to hurt me. But I cannot take that chance. I am writing you because I want you to know that if you ever touch me again in an angry way, I will leave and stay gone until I am assured by a counselor that it is safe to live with you. I love you, Liz. I love you too much to stay and let you hurt me and destroy your self-esteem. The evening after Paul received the letter, he apologized to Liz and assured her that it would never happen again. 6 months later, however, in a fit of anger, he grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. Liz didn't say a word, but the next day when he came home, Paul found the following note: I love you too much to stay and let you hurt me and destroy your self-esteem. I know you cannot be happy about what happened last night. I will not return until your counselor assures me that you have learned to handle your anger in a more responsible manner. Love, Liz. Her decisive response motivated Paul to call his pastor and then a counselor. He knew that he was in danger of losing his wife. He also knew that he had to learn to control his anger. After 3 months of individual counseling and 3 months of marital counseling, Liz and Paul were reunited. Years later, they're still together. Paul succeeded, with help, in breaking his pattern of abuse. How to help and explosive person. Both Margaret and Paul fell into abusive patterns of expressing anger. Such behaviors form over a period of years and typically do not change unless someone important to the individual pressures the person to get help. It is the threat of losing a significant relationship that often motivates the abuser to get help. Help is readily available, and destructive, abusive patterns can be changed. But such patterns will not simply go away with time. Family members and friends must learn to hold the explosive person accountable for his or her destructive response to anger. Does getting mad give energy? Does getting mad enhance athletic performance? No, says a psychologist who works with Olympic athletes. Research indicates that anger and aggression are actually associated with the sense of defeat. Contrary to what was once believed, venting anger doesn't lead to catharsis. It simply leads to more anger. Explosive, angry behavior is never constructive. It not only hurts the person at whom it is directed, it destroys the self-esteem of the person who is out of control. No one can feel good about themselves when they think about what they have done. In the heat of such angry explosions, people say and do things they later regret. Undisciplined anger that expresses itself in verbal and physical explosions will ultimately destroy relationships. The person on the receiving end loses respect for the person who is out of control and will eventually just avoid them. Some years ago, it was popular in certain psychological circles to believe that releasing anger by aggressive behavior could be a positive way of processing anger if the aggression was not toward a person. Thus, angry people were encouraged to beat pillows, punching bags, and dolls, or to take their aggression out on a golf ball. However, almost all research now indicates that the venting of angry feelings with such aggressive behaviors does not drain a person's anger but actually makes the person more likely to be explosive in the future. One explosion, whether verbal or physical, is not an acceptable way of handling one's anger. Recognizing implosive anger in destroying any building through implosion, the demolition crew places the destructive power within the building rather than outside, keeping all the rubble and glass inside. This is a graphic picture of what happens to the person who chooses to hold anger inside. One's life literally crumbles around internalized anger. Whereas explosive anger is readily observed by the person screaming, swearing, condemning, criticizing, and other words or acts of rage, implosive anger is not as easily recognized by others because it is, by definition, held inside. Some Christians who would deplore explosive expressions of anger fail to reckon with the reality that implosive anger is fully as destructive in the long run. Whereas explosive anger begins with rage and may quickly turn to violence, implosive anger begins with silence and withdrawal, but in time leads to resentment, bitterness, and eventually hatred. Implosive anger is typically characterized by 3 elements: denial, withdrawal, and brooding. Let's look at each of these. Those who handle their anger implosively often begin by denying that they are angry at all. This response to anger is especially tempting to Christians who have been taught that anger itself is sinful. Thus, one often hears individuals say one of the following: I'm not angry, but I am very frustrated. I'm not angry. I'm just upset. I'm not angry, but I am disappointed. I'm not angry. I just don't like it when people do me wrong. In almost all these cases, however, their condition is the same. The people are experiencing anger. Beverly illustrates this clearly. Sitting in my office on an October morning, she said to me, "I know that Christians are not supposed to get angry, and I don't think I am, but I'm so upset at what has happened that I don't know what to do." My brother talked my parents into selling their house and giving him the money to start a business. He moved them into a small apartment, promised to pay their monthly rent as long as they lived, and said that if they ever needed to go to a retirement center, by then he would be able to afford it. He did all of this without discussing the matter with me. I know my brother. His business ideas are always wild. Within 2 years, he will lose all the money and my parents will be on welfare. When I found out what had happened, I called him and he matter-of-factly told me about the whole process. He said he knew that I would not be upset because we both had talked earlier that they needed to be in a smaller place. I told him that I understood, and I was sure it would work out. But the more I think about it, the more upset I get. Beverly is obviously experiencing intense anger. Because she believes anger to be unchristian, she doesn't want to call it anger, so she uses the word upset. However, the real denial was in her conversation with her brother. She gave him the impression that his actions were acceptable, whereas in reality, she found them to be unacceptable. He doesn't know that she is angry, but, in fact, she is seething inside with anger. If she doesn't change her approach, the bombs of implosion will become deeply rooted inside of her, and in due time her life will collapse. See the likely results of implosive anger in next section. With implosive anger, withdrawal is the central strategy. Denying anger does not make it go away. Internalized anger, whether admitted or not, will have its destructive effect upon the body and psyche of the angry individual. The anger will grow until denial is no longer possible. But even more than denial, withdrawal is the central strategy of the people who struggle with implosive anger. While admitting anger to themselves and others, they withdraw from the person or situation that stirred up the anger. The idea is not denial but distance. If I can stay away from the person, or at least not talk to him when I am with him, perhaps my anger will diminish with time, the angry individual reassures herself. If the offending person notices the silent withdrawal and asks, "Is something wrong?" the withdrawer will respond, "No." What makes you think something's wrong? If the person pursues the issue by asking, "Well, you've been quieter than usual. You haven't asked me about my day, and you haven't said anything about yours," the withdrawer may respond, "I'm just tired. I had a hard day," as she walks out of the room. How implosion destroys this silent treatment, the withdrawal and avoidance, may last for a day or for years. The longer it continues, the more certain it is that resentment and bitterness will grow and fester. Often this internalized anger will express itself in what the psychologists call passive-aggressive behavior. The person is passive on the outside, trying to give the appearance that nothing is bothering him, but eventually the anger emerges in other ways, such as failure to comply with the requests the other person makes. Andy, for example, was exhibiting passive-aggressive behavior toward his wife, Rachel. He was angry with Rachel because she expressed no interest in sexual intimacy. Though Andy refused to discuss the matter openly with Rachel, when she asked him to help with the kids' baths, he simply continued checking his emails, not even acknowledging her request. When she asked him to please wash some windows on Saturday, he planned an outing with his son. Most of the time, Andy was not even fully conscious of what he was doing in his anger, but he was still getting back at her. And what about Rachel? Her lack of interest in sexual intimacy also could have been a passive-aggressive act. She might have been storing her own anger toward Andy because he had failed to spend quality time with her. She would not discuss the issue that sparked her anger, but her anger had gone underground, but still showed itself in her behavior. And so the passive-aggressive pattern begins a vicious cycle. Unless this destructive cycle is broken, it is only a matter of time until their marriage implodes. The person dealing with internal anger may also redirect that anger. The individual redirects his or her angry feelings away from the person or situation that stimulated the anger and toward another person or object. We are all familiar with a man who is angry with his boss but fears confronting the boss and chooses rather to come home, kick the cat, curse the children, and be verbally rude to his wife. This misplaced anger simply arouses more anger in the people who are abused and has nothing to deal with the situation that stimulated the original anger. The people who are the recipients of this misplaced anger are left in confusion. The person who is dishing out the misplaced anger may not be conscious of the connection between his supervisor's mistreatment and what he is doing to family members. Such expressions of misplaced anger do not process the original anger. It is still buried inside the person, waiting to be processed in a more positive manner. This suppression of anger, holding anger inside, will eventually lead to physiological and psychological stress. There is a growing body of research that shows a positive correlation between suppressed anger and hypertension, colitis, migraine headaches, and heart disease. However, the more pronounced results of suppressing anger are found in its impact upon one's psychological or emotional health. Internalized anger eventually leads to resentment, bitterness, and often hatred. All of these are explicitly condemned in Scripture and are viewed as sinful responses to anger. A third characteristic of implosive anger is brooding over the events that stimulated the anger. In the person's mind, the initial scene of wrongdoing is played over and over like a videotape. He sees the other person's facial expression. He hears the person's words. He senses a spirit. He relives the events that stimulated the angry emotions. He replays the psychological audio tapes of his own analysis of the situation. How could he be so ungrateful? Look at the number of years I've put into the company. He's only been here 5 years. He has no idea what's going on. If he knew how important I am to the company, he wouldn't treat me this way. I feel like resigning and letting him suffer. Or I feel like appealing to the board and getting him fired. For some who internalize anger, the end result will be an explosion, some act of violence toward the person who wronged them. On the tapes play as one wallows in his or her anger. The difficulty is that the tapes play only in the person's head. The anger is never processed with the person involved or with a counselor or trusted friend. The anger is developing into resentment and bitterness. If the process is not interrupted, the person will eventually experience an implosion in the form of an emotional breakdown, depression, or in some cases, suicide. However, for a growing number of these people who are internalizing anger, the end result will be not an implosion, but an explosion. In their desperate emotional state, they will commit some act of violence toward the person who wronged them. This is seen over and over again on the nightly news when the employee who was fired 9 months ago walks in and shoots the supervisor who fired him. At the age of 15, the abused child murders her parents. The mousy husband turns on his wife and destroys her life. Neighbors are always shocked by such events, saying to the reporter, "He seemed like such a nice man. I can't believe that he would do such a thing." What the neighbor could not observe was the internalized anger that had been fed by brooding over a long period of time. Anger was designed to be a visitor, never a resident, in the human heart. It should be obvious that implosive anger is fully as destructive as explosive anger. That is why the Scriptures always warn against internalizing anger. The Apostle Paul admonished, "In your anger do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." Ephesians 4 verses 26 to 27. Clearly, Paul instructed that we are to process anger quickly, not allowing it to linger inside beyond sunset. I suppose that if we got angry after dark, he would give us till midnight. But the principle is that anger is not to be held inside. In fact, to do so is to give the devil a foothold. That is, we are cooperating with Satan and setting ourselves up to sin even further. The apostle further challenged us to rid ourselves of anger. See Ephesians 4 verse 31, Colossians 3 verse 8. This is not an indication that anger itself is a sin. It is an indication that to allow anger to live inside is sinful. Solomon warned that anger resides in the lap of fools. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 9. The key word is resides. The fool lets the anger abide in him. The implication is that those who are wise will see that anger is quickly removed. Anger was designed to be a visitor, never a resident, in the human heart. All of us experience anger for the reasons noted in earlier chapters. But holding anger inside by denying, withdrawing, and brooding is not the Christian response to anger. In fact, to do so is to violate the clear teachings of Scripture. Bitterness is the result of stored anger, and the Bible warns us against bitterness. For example, see Acts 8 verse 23, Romans 3 verse 14, Hebrews 12 verse 15. Watch out for hate in the course of counseling through the years. I have heard teenagers say, "I hate my father." Almost always, such a statement is tied to a series of perceived wrongs committed by the father. The teenager has internalized the hurt and anger and has developed resentment, bitterness, and now hatred toward the father. I have also heard more than one wife say, "I hate my husband," and I've heard husbands express the same about their wives. Without exception, hatred does not develop overnight. Hatred is the result of internalized anger that remains planted in the heart of the individual. Eventually, the emotions of hurt from the internalized anger can harden into bitterness and even hatred. Almost always, those who hate wish ill upon the person at whom they are angry. Sometimes they end up perpetrating this ill themselves, as we noted in the examples above. The internalized anger erupts for all the world to observe. When someone wreaks evil upon the individual who wronged them, he has usurped the prerogative of God. The Scriptures say, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." Romans 12 verse 19 KJV. When we seek to impose judgment upon those who have wronged us, we will inevitably make things worse. How to defuse implosive anger? What positive steps can one take to defuse implosive anger? First, admit the tendency to yourself. It's true, I hold my anger inside. I find it very difficult to share with others that I am feeling angry. I know I am hurting myself by doing this. These are the statements that lead to help. Second, reveal your problem to a trusted friend or family member. Telling someone else and asking for their advice may help you decide whether you should confront the person or persons with whom you are angry. Perhaps you will choose to let the offense go, but at least this will be a conscious choice, and you can release your anger. If the person to whom you disclose your anger is unable to give you the help you need, then look for a pastor or counselor who can. Don't continue the destructive response of internalizing anger. Perhaps you know a friend who seems to be harboring anger inside. Why not take the risk of helping him or her? You might begin, "I could be wrong, but I genuinely care about you, and that is why I am asking this question. Could it be that you are angry with someone and are holding it all inside? If I'm wrong, just tell me. But if it's true, I would like to help you process it. I know it isn't good to hold anger inside. Would you like to talk about it?" Yes, you are running a risk by asking such questions. The person may tell you it is none of your business. On the other hand, your friend may open up, and your probing will be the first step in bringing his problem to the surface. If you are not able to help him further, then point the person to someone who can. A true friend does not sit silently and watch the self-destruction of a neighbor. The clear challenge of Scripture is that we learn to process anger in a positive, loving manner rather than by explosion or implosion. The practice of explosive anger and implosive anger is not only highly destructive to the individual who is so handling anger, but to everyone involved, including the community at large. Neither of these responses to anger can be accepted as appropriate in the life of a Christian. If you recognize either of these patterns in your own response to anger, I urge you to talk with a pastor, a counselor, or a friend. Share with someone your struggle with these destructive patterns. You cannot reach your potential for God and good in the world if you continue to respond to your anger either by explosion or implosion. That brings us to the next issue in handling our anger. What about the person who has been wronged for a lifetime and has stored the anger inside and has become an angry, resentful person? In the next chapter, we address that question. Quick take: are you in danger of imploding? Definition: implosive anger is internalized anger that is never expressed. Sparked by fear of confrontation, belief that feeling or expressing anger is wrong, how to recognize. Person denies that he or she is angry, responds by withdrawing, says things like, "I'm not angry, but I'm disappointed." Results: physiological and psychological stress. Passive-aggressive behavior can lead to resentment, bitterness, and even hatred and violence. How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it? Marcus Aurelius,